June 8, 2022. One of the strangest ideas about the Dhamma is that it's all about being accepting and non-judgmental. This comes from getting the teachings backwards. We understand that things are inconstant and impermanent, but we also have a desire for happiness. If you put the inconstancy first, then that means you have to learn how to scale back your desire for happiness, to realize that whatever you may want is going to be inconstant, stressful, and out of your control, so you have to learn to be okay with that. But that's got things backwards. Your desire for a reliable happiness should come first. If you see anything as inconstant, it doesn't meet the standards of that desire. When the Buddha taught inconstancy, it was basically a value judgment. Anything inconstant is stressful. Anything stressful is not worthy of being held on to as you or yours, because it wouldn't make you happy. That means you have to abandon it and look for something better to satisfy your desire for a happiness that doesn't change. So you should honor your desire for true happiness and give it pride of place. That's what the Buddha did. He wanted a happiness that wasn't subject to aging, illness, death, sorrow, or anything negative at all. He set out to find it, and he found it. So the story of his life tells us that the desire for happiness should be honored and taken seriously because it can be fulfilled without harm to anyone at all. Now, we're not talking here about simple hedonism, where you pursue whatever pleasure captures your fancy regardless of the long-term consequences. The Buddha wants you to take your desire for happiness seriously enough to realize that you want a happiness that's long-term. For it to be long-term, it can't depend on anyone's suffering. So you have to take other people's happiness into consideration as well. And you're going to have to be really careful about how you act, to make sure that what you do is actually conducive to happiness, that it doesn't harm anyone. These are the principles underlying the basic qualities of the Buddha: his wisdom, his compassion, his purity. That's one of the messages of the teaching, that you develop wisdom, compassion, and purity by being mature in your pursuit of happiness. You're wise in not settling for anything changeable, you're compassionate in taking the happiness of others into account, and you're pure in making sure that your actions actually fall in line with your ideals. When you look at the Buddha's quest for happiness, you realize that he was passing judgment on his actions all along the way. He would do something and then pass judgment on it. Is this conducive to true happiness? Is this what I want? If it's not, what should I change? He was passing judgment with a compassionate purpose, to change his actions, improve his actions, so that they would yield good results both for himself and for others. He was basically pursuing excellence. He trained himself to be excellent in his actions, and he ultimately reached the highest excellence of all, Nibbana. When, later on, he gave a list of other names for Nibbana, the list came down to 5 categories that give an idea of how good Nibbana is. One is that it's a type of consciousness. There's an awareness, but it's an awareness without an object. The image the Buddha gives is of a sunbeam. He asks the monks, suppose there's a house with a window in the eastern wall. When the sun rises, the sunbeams go through the window in the eastern wall. Where do they land? The monks reply, they land on the western wall. What if there's no western wall? They land on the ground. What if there's no ground? Back in those days, they thought that the earth was supported by water, so the monks reply, it lands on water. What if there's no water? Then it doesn't land. The image for the awakened mind is of a light beam that doesn't land. When it doesn't land, you can't see it because it's not reflecting off anything, but it's bright in and of itself. So there's consciousness in Nibbana. There's also freedom. Someone commented today that the idea of being outside of space of time sounded as if you were being frozen, but that's like imagining yourself frozen in a moment in time. That's not getting out of time, that's being trapped in time. Outside of space and time means you're totally free of any restraints. Another quality is bliss, total, unadulterated happiness. Another quality is truth. In other words, it doesn't change on you. It's not deceptive. And finally, the 5th quality is excellence. It's the ultimate. It's beyond. So as we follow the Buddha, we're pursuing excellence in our pursuit of happiness. Nowadays, when they talk about the pursuit of excellence, it's usually in terms either of sport or of making fancy watches, but that's a very limited excellence. You can devote all your energies to mastering a game or to making something that looks impressive and tells very accurate time, but there are so many more worthwhile things to be doing. The Buddha found the most worthwhile excellence to pursue, which is a happiness that's harmless and never disappoints. But as many people have noted, the descriptions he gave of that happiness sometimes don't sound all that inviting. One of the first discussion groups I led when I came back here to the States on the Four Noble Truths went through the truths in order: 1, 2, 3, 4. We got to the third noble truth and talked about Nibbana. Then we got to the fourth noble truth and we ended up talking about jhana. Everyone in the group said that jhana sounded a lot more appealing than Nibbana. Maybe the words or the mental images we associate with the words are more appealing, but when you've really mastered jhana and started contemplating it, you begin to realize that it has its drawbacks. To begin with, you can get really addicted to the pleasure. It feels really, really good. But you also realize that in order to maintain that pleasure, that sense of stillness, you have to work hard. It requires an unending effort. When that fact hits you, that's when you think, maybe something unfabricated would be better. When the opening to the unfabricated comes, you go for it, and you realize it is much better. Think of Ajahn Mahabua comparing the state of the luminous mind that at first he thought was awakening against the actual experience of awakening that he later came to. He said, "Excuse me, that the luminous mind, as compared to awakening, was a pile of shit." When you get that point in your practice, your sensitivity toward happiness, your sensitivity to what's involved in fabricating experience gets so acute that you really do see that the unfabricated is the ideal alternative even to very bright and expansive mind states. Until then, there's a tendency in the mind to say, well, I can imagine something else I'd prefer. But look at your imaginings. We've been led around by our imaginings for how long? We don't know how long. We've been going around and around and around for countless eons, led by our desire to think up this, think up that. I can imagine something better than this. I can imagine something better than that. There's a tendency in the mind to keep flowing out. The Buddha called that asava. We're so addicted to our imaginings that the idea of a pleasure that doesn't require that we do any imagining, or do anything at all, sounds very disorienting. A pleasure that doesn't require feeding sounds very alien to our ideas of happiness, all of which depend on feeding in one way or another, either physically or mentally. So from the outside, Nibbana may not sound all that good. But the Buddha said again and again, if you think that there's going to be any disappointment or sense of dissatisfaction at all in Nibbana, that's wrong view. What do we do in the meantime? We follow the Four Noble Truths in refining our powers of judgment, because the Four Noble Truths themselves are excellent standards for judgment. Wherever there's suffering, you've got to look for its cause, because it's something you want to abandon. You want to bring about the end of suffering. It's not something to just note or to continue playing with. Of course, the Buddha's analysis of suffering, the 5 clinging aggregates, when you actually think about what it means, goes against the grain. It's saying that we cling to the things we want to see as ours, want to see as us, because we like them, yet that clinging is suffering. In other words, we suffer from our likes. We have to try to comprehend what he means in saying that. He tells us that we have to abandon our cravings, but we like our cravings an awful lot. As he said, wherever we go with craving as our companion. It's constantly whispering in our ears, getting us to do stupid things. He's trying to wean us away from that harmful companionship by describing the pleasures of the path, especially the pleasures of concentration. Try to make these pleasures your friends. What you're doing is that you're taking some good desires and you're making them part of the path, the desire to be skillful, the desire to find a happiness that's not subject to the drawbacks of sensuality. So you're continuing to foster some desires. You're continuing to flow toward the concentration. As you get more and more used to it, you realize, okay, this is a better pleasure, a value judgment, but a good one. You find that there are layers to the concentration as you peel them away. That too is a value judgment. You begin to realize that some states of concentration are more solid, more expansive, more peaceful than others, and so you go for them. This is what lifts your sights as to what's possible in terms of happiness and pleasure. All too many of us are afraid of this pleasure because we've enjoyed pleasures in the past and then been really disappointed by them. Or we've gotten really heedless as we enjoyed those pleasures, and we've suddenly found ourselves in danger. So there's a part of the mind that has some trepidation around pleasure. But when you find a more reliable pleasure like this, and it really is more reliable, after a while, you begin to let go of your fear of it. You find you can really enjoy it. There's still a little bit of heedlessness possible with concentration as you just hang out in stillness, but it's a lot better than hanging out with your normal pleasures, the pleasures of sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations, and sensual fantasies. So here, again, you're making a value judgment. We're not here just to rest content with whatever we've got. As the Buddha said, the secret to his awakening was that he was discontent with regard to skillful qualities, to say nothing of unskillful qualities. Anything that was unskillful in his mind, he would drop it. As for what was skillful, he said, if there's anything more I can do, anything I still have to master that I haven't mastered yet, I'll go for it. That pursuit of excellence was what enabled him to find the true Dhamma. This is a pursuit of excellence that really is satisfying. You see people pursuing excellence in sport, but then they get too old to play the game, and the latter part of their lives is a real disappointment. They get really good at one thing, and then they can't do it anymore. But with meditation, you can keep on doing it until your last breath, and even beyond, and it's still possible to achieve great things. There are stories in the canon of people who gained awakening while dying. One of the Buddha's relatives became a stream into red death, and when the Buddha happened to mention that was what he'd attained, his other relatives were upset. They said, well, if he can do it, then anybody can do it. That's actually good news. This is something you can keep on pursuing and pursuing. There may be some setbacks, but you can keep at it. And if you're observant and use your ingenuity, or as the Buddha would say, if you commit to it and keep on reflecting again and again, you find that there are better and better levels of practice that you can accomplish. And you see they really are better, so you go for the best you can manage. This is one area where going for the best will never disappoint. So hold in mind the fact that the goal, Nibbana, really is excellent. And even though you don't focus your primary attention on the goal, the strategy of having a path is that you focus instead on each step of the path. Be confident that the path is leading you to a place so good that you can't even imagine how good it is. It's that special, and it's way better than anything else. August 16, 2022. When you meditate, you're watching your mind, so you want to give yourself a good mind to watch. Good, not in the sense of being smart with book learning, but more in the sense of having good qualities of the heart, a mind that's used to acting on impulses for generosity, virtue, and goodwill. That kind of mind is easy to watch. You want to understand the different steps in the processes of how it creates a thought and how it creates a state of becoming. These things are a lot easier to watch when the mind is creating good states of becoming, acting on good thoughts, because it would be disheartening to see all the nefarious intentions you usually give into, if that's your habit. Years back, I was co-teaching a meditation retreat, and one afternoon, one of the retreatants suddenly broke down and started crying. It was really freaky. He was heaving deep sobs, but everyone else in the room was sitting very quietly as if nothing were happening. I found out later, 1, that he was a former drug dealer, and that as he was sitting and getting the mind really quiet, it came to him how many lives he had ruined. Then, 2, I learned that this is a common occurrence in meditation retreats. Take people right off the street with no basic training in virtue, no basic training in generosity, get them to sit still with their minds, and negative things come welling up. This was why Ajahn Suwat was so right when he was teaching another meditation retreat in Massachusetts. The retreatants seemed awfully grim as they sat there hour after hour. And he commented that they were grim because they didn't have a good background in virtue or generosity. Part of it, he said, was that when you practice generosity and virtue, you gain confidence in the Buddha, that this path he taught is a path of happiness. But also, as I said, if you're used to acting on good intentions, then when you want to understand the process of how an intention is formed and the internal dialogue that goes around it, it's a lot easier to watch because the intentions have been good. Which is why an important part of the meditation is not simply sitting here, knowing how to stay with the breath, but living a life of being generous, being virtuous, and developing goodwill for all beings, perfecting these good habits as skills. In other words, you want to get it right, because after all, you're going to be trying to develop a path that's composed of right factors, everything from right view to right concentration, and they all have to be approached as skills. So you're not just good, but you're also inquisitive as to what it means to be really good, to be skillful, to act on good intentions so that they give the best possible results. Skill and generosity goes beyond the simple impulse to be generous. You're trying to develop the right attitude toward the act of giving a gift. You're trying to develop the right motivation. You try to give gifts that are appropriate, and you try to find good people to give them to, so that the act of generosity really does generate happiness. You may have read the list of the different kinds of motivation you might have for being generous. It starts out with, "I'll get this back," sometimes hoping to get it back with interest later in this life or maybe the next life. That's the lowest motivation. It does count as a good motivation, though. It's better than not being generous at all. The Buddha says it leads to one of the lower levels of the sensual heavens. But just as there are higher levels of heaven, so there are higher levels of motivation, such as reflecting on the fact that giving is good. It's simply a good thing to do. Or that, when you see that there are people who are lacking in things that you have, and you have more than enough, it's not right that you don't share. That's an even higher motivation. Or you see that giving makes your mind serene and joyful. All the way up to, it's a natural ornament of the mind. In other words, it's just a natural expression of the mind, without your thinking about what you're going to get in return. So you can work on your motivation. You can also work on your attitude. You're not just going through the motions. You think, something really important or good will come from this act of generosity. You give gifts that are appropriate for the recipient's needs. It's interesting, when the Buddha measures the goodness that comes from a gift, he never talks about the monetary value of the gift, aside from saying that it's good to give other people things that are at least as good as the things you'd ordinarily use, so that you can be proud of the gift afterwards. In other words, you stop and give some thought to what it means to be generous, and how generosity can give rise to happiness. As you develop that skill, you get even more thoughtful. You see implications in the act of generosity that you may not have thought of before. The same with the precepts. In the beginning, you simply abide by the rules. Then you find that there are times when it's difficult to abide by the rules. So you figure out how to stick to the precept, yet at the same time not cause yourself or anyone else any needless harm. The primary example is when you know some information that somebody might want to abuse, and they ask for it. You've got to figure out some way of not divulging the information, but at the same time not misrepresenting the truth. That develops your ingenuity. And the simple fact that you're keeping the precepts means that, 1. You have to be mindful to keep the precept in mind. 2. You have to be alert to your actions. And 3. You really have to be ardent in doing your best to withstand any impulses to break the precepts. Mindfulness, alertness, ardency, these are skills you're going to need as you meditate. And finally, with goodwill, as you spread thoughts of goodwill, you stop to think, what does it mean, may all beings be happy? You realize that, ideally, you're wishing for them to create the causes for happiness. If they've been behaving badly, you want them to see the error of their ways and voluntarily act more skillfully. That's a wish you can have for anyone. At the same time, you're learning how to resist any impulse to ill will. And you learn to recognize ill will for what it is. Sometimes it can dress itself up as righteous anger, a desire for justice. But wanting to see somebody suffer, no matter how bad that person has been in the past, does count as a form of ill will, so you've got to be careful. At the same time, you're learning how to watch your mind. You learn what it means to create a mental state of goodwill. It's not a natural expression of your innate nature, because it's just as easy to have ill will for other people as it is to have goodwill. With the Brahma Viharas, we're trying to take our human goodwill, which tends to be partial, and make it the goodwill of a high level of heavenly being. In other words, we're making it universal. That requires verbal fabrication, mental fabrication, all the components of a good state of concentration. Generosity, virtue, and developing universal goodwill are the traditional forms of panna, which is usually translated as merit, but is better translated as goodness. All too often, these forms of goodness are treated as something totally separate from the practice of meditation, but goodness and meditation are closely intertwined. Acts of goodness prepare the mind for meditation by developing good habits, particularly the habit of trying to do something well, to get it right. And, as I said earlier, they give you a good mind to watch. I was reading a while back the strange idea that the hope of getting things right is a major cause for stress and suffering. Therefore, you should learn how to relax around it, let it dissolve away, and just be okay with things as they are, and not try to impose your ideas of perfection on things. That attitude may be based on a misreading of the Satipatthana Sutta, where it talks about seeing feelings arising and passing away, discerning a feeling of pleasure, discerning a feeling of pain, neither pleasure nor pain, seeing mind states arising and passing away, a restricted mind, an unrestricted mind, concentrated, unconcentrated. It makes it sound as if you just watch whatever's going to happen, without wanting it to be good or bad. But when you look into the list of feelings the Buddha talks about, there are feelings of the flesh and feelings not of the flesh. Feelings of the flesh happen pretty much willy-nilly, but feelings not of the flesh are caused by your desire to practice. A pleasure not of the flesh is the pleasure of concentration. It's not going to happen on its own. A pain not of the flesh comes from your desire to gain awakening, realizing that the desire is not yet fulfilled. That's a good pain, a pain that can help motivate you to practice. Equanimity, not of the flesh, the equanimity that comes when getting into fourth jhana, is also something you have to develop. As for the mind states, they're usually paired, concentrated, unconcentrated, released, unreleased, the implication being, if you think of the duties of the Four Noble Truths, that if an unskillful mind state is there, you want to switch it over to its skillful counterpart. So we are trying to get things right. After all, the duty of mindfulness is not simply to watch things arise and pass away. Its duty, if there's something you know that is skillful that's not there in your mind, is to be mindful to give rise to it. Once something good has arisen in this way, you're mindful to try to maintain it, to make sure it doesn't pass away. This is called mindfulness as a governing principle. So you are trying to get it right, but you're learning to find joy in getting it right. You don't treat it as a chore. As with any skill, this comes with a sense of pride, a sense of self-esteem, and it's healthy pride, healthy self-esteem. It's all to the good. Sometimes people like to quote that passage from Ajahn Mun's poem where he talks about how one of the final things you have to get over as you practice the path is the desire to be good. The implication being, as they say, well, you can let go of that one pretty early on. But that's not what he's saying. After all, look at his practice. He really tried to make something good out of himself. Everything in the training, from the most minor rules all the way up to practice of liberation, he tried to master it. As his students said, he made himself totally Dhamma. And he didn't do that by not trying to be good, not trying to get it right. It was by trying to get it right that he could put himself in a position where he could finally let go of right and wrong safely, because he'd mastered things. He'd brought his mind to completion. In Ajahn Lee's words, he let go as a rich person, not as a pauper. So it's perfectly okay to want to get it right. In fact, we've got to make the effort to get it right. This is a path with right and wrong factors. If you're going to be on the path, you've got to get it right, all the way from right view through right concentration. The trick is learning how to enjoy getting it right as you do it. As you develop the right attitude, it does become a joy. You can look at your behavior, you can watch your mind, and it's a good mind to watch. There's a sense of satisfaction that comes, that's entirely in line with the practice. So as the Buddha said, when you see that you've done something right, take joy in that fact, and then continue training. That's the right attitude to have. Because the mind is purposeful. September 13th, 2023. Meditation involves two things. One is getting the mind to be still, and the other is gaining insight into its processes. We can do the two together. The Buddha talks about the process of what he calls sankhara, which we translate as fabrication. As he points out, we fabricate all kinds of things. We fabricate our sense of the body, our feelings, our perceptions, and our thought constructs. Even our consciousness has an element of intention. Of course, we don't fabricate these things out of nothing. We start with raw material, the potentials coming in from our past karma. And then, for the sake of having an experience of the present moment, we put these things together. Notice that for the sake of this fabrication, these processes of intention aim at something. They're motivated by desire, and although we may hear a lot of negative things about desire in meditation circles, the Buddha had some positive things to say about it as well. We can take this motive force inside the mind and use it to put together the path. All of the path, the Buddha said, is fabricated. Concentration, the heart of the path, is something fabricated, and that means it requires desire, the desire to get the mind focused and to settle down. So you use these processes, you use this movement of the mind that's always for the sake of something, and you direct it to be for the sake of the path. So observe yourself as you settle down with the breath. Focus on wanting to be with the breath. This is one of the proper uses of desire. You want the mind to settle down, but you don't focus directly on the mind, and you don't focus on thoughts of settling down. You focus on the breath, because you know that if you can stay with the breath, it'll get you where you want to go. You focus on assembling the causes, and the results will take care of themselves. So pay full attention to the breath. If you find the mind slipping off, just keep coming back. Try to breathe in a way that feels good, relaxing when you're feeling tense, energizing when you're feeling tired. Think of the breath as a whole body process. It's not just the air coming in and out through the nose, that's just the result of the breathing. The breathing is the energy that goes through the movement of the muscles, the impulses in the nerves and in the blood vessels. If you're really sensitive, you can sense these energies anywhere in the body. But notice where they're most prominent right now and allow your attention to settle there. And keep after this. Other thoughts will come in, and you have to tell yourself, no, not right now, got more important work right here. The mind has spent so much time thinking about random things and about other things that are not quite so random but still scatter you about, but now you're going to devote its thinking in all of its processes to getting it to settle down. A large part of that strategy lies in making the breath an attractive place to be. That way, when you wander off, the idea of coming back is attractive. You want to come back. If you wander off again, you want to come back again. Each time you come back, reward yourself with a breath that feels especially gratifying. Think of the breath as being all around you, so that you're not just in one side of the body looking at the breath in another part of the body. You've got the breath all around you, surrounding you, bathing you. As for any other thoughts, any other responsibilities you may have right now, you don't have to think about them. You'll come back to them some other time, but not right now. You want to honor your original intention, which is to get the mind still with the breath so that it can see itself clearly. A lot of what it'll see is this process of fabrication. We're fabricating a state of concentration. That's the best way to get to know fabrication, by doing something skillful with it. It's like learning about wood. When you make different pieces of furniture out of wood, you learn its characteristics, how the different kinds of wood respond to being planed, how they respond to being sawed. You learn this because you want to use the wood for the sake of something. If you just sat and stared at the wood, you wouldn't learn much, but when you make things out of it, you learn a lot about its peculiarities, its qualities, what kind of wood is good for what kind of object. The same with fabrication, this process of, for the sake of something. You devote all your efforts for the sake of getting the mind to settle down in a state of being not only still, but also very clear, very alert. The Buddha recommends 3 qualities to work with the breath. 1 is mindfulness, the ability to keep something in mind. In this case, you keep in mind the fact that you want to stay here. If you've meditated before, you want to keep in mind what techniques have worked in the past and what techniques have not, so that if you find yourself slipping into something unskillful, you can do something about it. This is where the other two qualities come in. Alertness, watching what you're doing, and ardency, wanting to do this well. The ardency is the discernment factor here. You're ardent with a purpose, trying to do this as skillfully as you can. That's the kind of discernment we're after. Practical, pragmatic, purposeful. Ajahn Lee points to ardency as the discernment factor in mindfulness practice for several reasons. One is that, out of these three factors, ardency is what makes the others right. After all, you can be mindful about anything. You can keep anything in mind. Last year's baseball scores, things at work, past desires that you could dig up again. Here you've got a whole hour. You could fill the hour with sensual fantasies if you wanted to, but you realize that that would be a waste. Why do you realize that it would be a waste? Because of the ardency, and you're ardent because you have another purpose in being here. The same with alertness. You could listen to the sound of the crickets, you could listen to the sound of the planes, the sound of the dogs off in the distance, but what would that accomplish? Nothing much. But if you're alert to what you're actually doing and the results you're getting, you're going to learn something useful. Here again, ardency. This is a wise use of your mindfulness, a wise use of your alertness. And here again you see the whole point of doing something with a purpose. When you understand these processes of fabrication as you do them skillfully, that helps you understand them when you're doing them unskillfully. When you're giving in to desires that actually would be harmful to you, either you would gain what you wanted, but it would involve harm, or would disappoint you, or you wouldn't get what you wanted at all. That's one of the prime causes of aversion. It's because we're constantly doing something for the sake of something that aversion arises, because our purposes are thwarted. You could think of all the things that are happening in the world right now, but there are a lot of areas in the world where you have no particular desire that things turn out one way or another, so you can read the news about those places and be pretty equanimous. But if the news goes against your desires, you're going to get averse. It's amazing how many desires we have for things that have little bearing on what we can actually accomplish or influence. We may want justice all over the world, and then when you see injustice anywhere, it can get you upset. You may have had a bad experience in your life concerning a certain kind of relationship where one person abused you or somebody else, so anytime you see abuse anywhere else, it can get you upset because you have a desire to see that abuse not happen again. So, your desires can spread out into quite large areas, and then you can be averse to quite a large number of things. That's one way in which desire gives rise to aversion. There's another in which you realize that when you get averse to something and you act on that aversion, other people give in to you, so you've learned that aversion equals power. This is another way in which desire gives rise to aversion. You want something to be done and you feel, I've got to be as angry as possible to get it done. So, it's possible to look at all the unskillful qualities of the mind and see them as the result of this tendency that we have to be purposeful, to be doing things constantly for the sake of something further on. Fear can also be explained in this way. We're attached to certain things and we're afraid that something will come along and destroy what we have, or what we want to have. So if you want to understand your fears, look for your attachments. To understand your aversion, look for your desires, realizing that sometimes it's not simply a case of thwarted desire leading to aversion. There's also the possibility that you desire the aversion itself. But when you see how to use the processes of fabrication to put together a good state of concentration, and you have a sense that you can point this process of fabrication in different directions, then, when you start seeing the drawbacks of your unskillful desires or your aversion, you know that you could fabricate things in a different way. Here again, breath meditation is really helpful. The Buddha talks about 3 kinds of fabrication. There's bodily fabrication, the breath. Verbal fabrication, the way you talk to yourself. In technical terms, it's directed thought and evaluation. And then mental fabrication, perceptions, the labels you put on things, and then feelings, feeling tones of pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. As you're working with the breath, getting the mind to settle down, you're getting hands-on experience with all 3 of these kinds of fabrication. The perceptions, for instance, that you have of the breath as a whole-body process, the feelings of ease, refreshment you can create by the way you talk to yourself about how you breathe, evaluating how it's going and making changes as you see fit. When you can create a state of concentration through these processes, you look at your other more unskillful ways of engaging in them, and you realize that you could change. You don't have to follow your old ways. You can question the desires, say, that give rise to aversion, and you can question the desires that give rise to fear. A lot of these desires seem natural because they're habitual. You've given in to them many times before, but it's good to see that they're artificial. This is why we use the word fabrication to translate sankhara, to get a sense of how things are put together in a certain way, jerry-rigged in a certain way, but they don't have to be that way, especially if they're not skillful. It's in this way that getting the mind still can start bringing about insight into these processes of fabrication. And that's precisely how insight is defined, learning how to view fabrications in a way that gives rise to dispassion for the whole process. So instead of pretending that you're just observing things as they are, ignoring the fact that you're actually putting them together, an attitude that doesn't lead to much in terms of genuine insight, be clear about the fact that you're putting things together, and right now you want to put together a state of stillness, ease, refreshment. The potentials are right here. Look carefully, experiment, and you'll find them. As you find them and devote them to the right purpose, you gain not only tranquility but also the beginnings of insight. They work in tandem in this way. Wearing the breath. January 10th, 2022. We often say to watch the breath when you meditate, but that may be an unfortunate choice of words. Subconsciously, it can make you think that your eyes are somehow involved. And because your eyes are in your head, you're up in your head, watching the breath in another part of the body, but that's not the effect we're trying to get. We're trying to fill the body with a sense of awareness and a sense of ease. Think of the first 3 frames of reference for establishing mindfulness: body, feelings, and mind. As you meditate, you're trying to get them to fill one another. The mind fills the body, a feeling of ease fills the body, and the breath filling the body is the glue that makes that happen. So, instead of watching the breath, think of yourself being bathed in the breath or wearing the breath. It's all around you. When the Buddha describes the breath, he lists it as one of the aspects of the wind property in the body, which means it's an aspect of form. It's not the tactile sensation of the air at the nose or going over your lip. It's something already there in the body. So, ask yourself, where do you feel the flow of energy as the air comes in, the air goes out right now? Where is it most prominent? Focus your attention there and try to figure out which ways of breathing feel best. Again, you're feeling it, you're wearing it. It's what nowadays we call proprioception, your sense of the body as you feel it from within. The reason why we want to get our awareness all around is because when thoughts come into the mind, the fact that they're able to stay for a while means that there has to be a little bit of tension someplace in the body to hold them, like a little marker, and those patterns of tension can be anywhere. So, if you're focused at one point, say, the tip of the nose, and you're trying to block out everything else, you're going to miss where those patterns of tension are. You're going to miss an important step in the meditation, which is to see thoughts as they arise and catch them when they're still in the process of forming. At that point, they haven't turned into becomings yet. A becoming is a world in the mind. You have a desire, and then a world forms around it, the world where that desired object is located. The next question is, where are you in relationship to that world? Usually, once your thought has gotten to that point, you are in the thought, you're out of your body, then the thought can take you anywhere. But there are stages leading up to that point. In fact, the Buddha said, seeing the stages leading up to that is the way of getting round the dilemma of the fact that suffering is caused by the kinds of craving that lead to becoming. One of the kinds of craving that leads to becoming is craving for becoming itself, while another one is craving for non-becoming. In other words, you have an identity in a world and you want to snuff it out. That's the dilemma. We're trying to put an end to becoming, but if you sit here thinking about putting an end to a becoming that's already happened, it's going to create more becoming. What you've got to do is to see the processes that lead up to the fact of becoming and keep it in place, and develop some dispassion for them. The best way to do that is to be sensitive to the formation of a thought at the very early stages, when it's still just an inchoate desire, and ideally even before it becomes a desire for anything in particular, it's just a desire for something else. There's a stirring of the breath someplace in the body, and then you identify it as a desire for this, a desire for that, a thought about this, a thought about that, and then you go with it. As a meditator, you want to catch it at the stage before you've slapped on that perception. So, we stay with the breath as much as we can, try to settle in. Feel as if you're sitting here surrounded by breath, and your awareness surrounds you too. In addition to having that subconscious idea that we're watching the breath with our eyes and we're in our head, we also have the subconscious idea that we're facing forward. When you close your eyes, which direction is the mind facing? It doesn't have to face anywhere. It can be centered and then spread out, facing in all directions. That's the quality you're trying to develop. As the Buddha said, you want the upper part of your body to feel like the lower part of the body, and vice versa. In other words, up and down, front and back, you want them to be all equal, so that wherever there's that stirring in the mind, that stirring in the body, you're going to see it. It's like watching a play. If you're just focused on one point in the body, it's like being in the audience. Between scenes, they're going to lower the curtain to change the scenery. Once the scenery's in place, they raise the curtain again, and you're in the world of the next scene. As for the actors who are not involved in that scene, they're behind the scenes. You don't see them when you're in the audience, so you don't see the full production. Ideally, you want to be behind the scenes. You don't want your view to be blocked by a curtain. When they're moving the scenery, you want to see them move the scenery around. When the actors are getting ready to come on stage, you want to see them in the process of psyching themselves up to get on stage. That's when you really understand the production. In the same way, we're trying to understand the production of our thoughts. After all, where is the source of suffering? The Buddha calls it the origination of suffering. When he uses the word origination, 1, it means we have to look for the cause, and 2, we usually have to look for the cause in the mind. So we're trying to understand our own minds. If you can understand your own mind, then you don't have to suffer. That's the simple principle, but working out that simple principle will require a lot of all-around awareness. So, try to fully inhabit the body as you breathe in, as you breathe out, so that your knowledge of the breath energy in the feet is in the feet. Your knowledge of the breath energy in the torso is in the torso. You're not trying to pull it all up into the head. Now, there will be a center, but it's good to have the center lower than the head. If it's up in the head, sometimes it aggravates the fact that the nerves in the head tend to be overworked in our culture. So, you want to familiarize yourself with what's going on in the body, all the parts of the body. This is why, when we give guided meditations, we take people through the body section by section, know the navel in the navel, know the chest in the chest, the hands in the hands, the feet in the feet. Open up to the awareness that's already there and see the energy already there. It may feel very still and motionless in some parts of the body, but that's okay. As long as it doesn't feel tight and blocked, it becomes a good place to settle in. Once your awareness is enlarged like this, you're more and more firmly established in the present moment. Your concentration is the kind of concentration that can actually look at other things and not lose its center, not lose its foundation. If your concentration is one-pointed, then when you change the point, you've changed your concentration. But when your awareness is all around like this, then thoughts can come into the framework. You can see them come in, you can see them go, you can begin to see the stages, but the framework of your concentration is not overturned by that. It's in this way that concentration leads to discernment, so that you can do concentration work and discernment work at the same time. And in this way, your discernment is guaranteed not to turn into thought worlds or speculation worlds. It's a discernment that sees the processes as they're happening, step by step, right here, right now, without losing this frame of reference. As long as it's based in this frame of reference, the whole body as you experience it in the present, you're more and more likely to see things as processes rather than getting into processed worlds and riding along with them. That helps to liberate you from a lot of unskillful thinking. It's in that way that you perform the duties of the noble truths, seeing clinging as clinging, in other words, a step before becoming, seeing craving as craving, 2 steps before becoming. That's when you can do something about the problem of suffering. When you've slipped into a becoming, it's too late. So, you want to be here, grounded, seeing things as processes. That's when you're sitting at the right place, at the right time, looking at the right things in the right way.